Good evening, everybody, and welcome. Richard Norton Smith believes that history is the most absorbing of professions. He says that there is no excuse for a dull book, a dull museum, or a dull tour, especially when dealing with history, the most fascinating subject I know. His biography of Nelson Rockefeller was described as compelling by the New York Times, enthralling and absorbing by the New Yorker, and gripping, magisterial, and deeply researched by fellow historian Michael Beschloss. Richard has put his considerable talents to work, not only in research and prize-winning books and articles, but also as a much sought-after speaker and television commentator, as director of 5 presidential libraries, and as a leader of small group historical tours. You'll find many of the details in your programs, so I won't repeat them here. But his comments in a tribute to fellow historian David McCullough some years ago illuminate his own thoughts about what good history should involve: academic rigor, literary grace, inspiration as well as information, the perseverance of a detective, the curiosity of a child, the imagination of the artist, and a journalist's determination to get it right. He generally likes to take the long view. In his introductory contribution to the 29 book, The Presidents, Smith noted how ephemeral are appraisals based on real-time history, and said that it's important for historians to take a second look when polarized emotions cool and sensitive papers become available. However, he goes on to say that, of course, some criteria transcend political or academic fashion. Character counts as much in the age of Trump as it did when George Washington was president. That is the subject of his talk today. Please welcome Richard Norton Smith to discuss presidential character. Can it be set in stone?
A minor correction. This is not a talk about Trump. First of all, I want to thank the organizers for their kindness in inviting me here. I grew up in New England, which means I'm somewhat parochial in my view of things like mountains. We think we invented them, you know. The Green Mountains, the White Mountains, if you've ever been there, particularly in the fall, you know. But I discovered today that while New England has impressive mountains, Colorado has majestic ones. I haven't gotten over my parochialism. John Adams famously observed to a friend that Harvard College and our Boston town meetings have set the universe in motion. I think that's a little bit much. And hopefully over the last 50 years or so, I've unlearned that degree of regional pride. A couple things. Before I start this little talk, which is self-explanatory, I, as you heard, think that it's the question I get asked, and other historians are asked most frequently by the press. It happens about every President's Day. It certainly happens close to every inauguration day. Is, will you pass judgment on the sitting president? And some people take the bait, and I don't. I think it's impossible to pass historical as opposed to journalistic judgment on a sitting president, or for that matter, the last few presidents. And I'll talk a little bit about the differences between journalistic and historical viewpoints when we get into this. And the other fact is, I hope I'm intelligent enough to realize that for me to make any definitive statement regarding the incumbent president would immediately alienate half of the people in the room and probably turn them off to the objectivity of anything else that I had to say. So when we get to questions, I'll be delighted to opine if you want, and hopefully more usefully answer with some knowledge. The late, great historian and Lincoln scholar David Herbert Donald liked to tell of his 1962 visit to the Kennedy White House, in the course of which JFK voiced unhappiness over the glib methods employed by some historians in rating his predecessors as below average or even failure. "No one has a right to grade a president," said Kennedy, "not even poor James Buchanan, who has not sat in his chair, examined the mail and information that came across this desk, and learned why he made his decisions." The implication, of course, of those remarks, made no doubt at a moment of frustration with more contemporary assessments of presidential performance, is that only a president is qualified to judge the success or failure of another president. Try telling that to the hundreds, if not thousands, of assistant professors, PhD candidates, visiting scholars, and plain history buffs who long ago formed a consensus regarding poor James Buchanan and his shortcomings. Is he the worst president on record? I don't know. Personally, I'm inclined to reserve that dubious title for Andrew Johnson, the un-Lincoln, who squandered the moral high ground gained by his martyred predecessor through the blood and sacrifice of Northern armies, and whose utter failure to grasp the difference between Reconstruction and what he preferred to call restoration set back the cause of racial justice in this country at least 100 years. Until, by the way, another Southern president named Johnson, who succeeded another martyred president named Kennedy. Of course, Lincoln, too, was judged harshly by his contemporaries. Quote, "Mr. Lincoln will go down to posterity as the man who could not read the signs of the time, who plunged his country into a great war without a plan, who failed without excuse, and who fell without a friend." So declared the august London Times in the autumn of 1864. Now, this comes as a surprise to modern-day Americans, most of whom believe that Lincoln was born on Mount Rushmore. Harry Truman might have been thinking of Lincoln when he defined a statesman as a politician who's been dead for 20 years. Pretty shrewd observation for a failed haberdasher. That was only one of the milder epithets affixed to the so-called little man from Missouri, of whom it was said, "To err is Truman." Forget NATO and the Marshall Plan, aid to Greece and Turkey, communist containment in Korea, and a desegregated armed forces. When he left office in 1953, Mr. Truman took with him some of the lowest popularity ratings on record. For a while, he languished in near obscurity, only to be reassessed against the anguish of Vietnam and the betrayal of Watergate. In an age of focus group convictions, Harry Truman came to be seen as the real deal. Witness his observation, "I wonder how far Moses would have gone if he'd taken a poll in Egypt." Above all, Americans came to admire a president who emphatically answered the question, does character count? "Three things ruin a man," Truman observed: power, money, and women. I never wanted power, I never had any money, and the only woman in my life is up at the house now. Everyone knows about the sign on Truman's desk asserting "the buck stops here." Much less well known is the sign that Dwight Eisenhower kept on his Oval Office desk. Translated from Latin, it read, "Gently in manner, strongly indeed." Academic critics for a long time were inclined to dismiss the old soldier as a grandfatherly duffer, smiling his way through a bland decade. All that began to change when the first of Ike's White House papers became available in 1966. Soon, students of the presidency were competing in praise of what Princeton's Fred Greenstein called Ike's hidden hand leadership. Half a century later, scholars are still peeking behind his artfully conceived defenses. Revisionism of a different sort is being made possible by the opening of Lyndon Johnson's White House tapes and the publication of Ronald Reagan's correspondence and diaries. There's nothing new about this. Americans have been revising our estimates of presidents for as long as we've had presidents. Quote, if ever a nation was debauched by a man, the American nation has been debauched by Washington. If ever a nation was deceived by a man, the American nation has been deceived by Washington. That's how the Philadelphia Aurora assessed George Washington's legacy in the twilight of the first presidency. His insistence that the United States remain aloof from old world quarrels brought savage criticism of the aging hero, whose judgment and even patriotism were called into question. Posterity, needless to say, has been kinder in its estimate. At the height of the debunking craze of the 1920s, Calvin Coolidge was asked by a reporter if Washington's historical standing had been permanently diminished. Coolidge went to the window of his White House study, pulled back a drape, and pointed in the direction of the nearby mall. I see his monument is still there, he said. 5 months from now, Iowans will begin the quadrennial process of choosing a president. What tests will they apply? What standards should they have in mind? The Constitution offers little guidance. The only legal qualifications it spells out require that one must be 35 years of age or older, native born, and a resident within the United States for at least 14 years. That's it. Nowhere does our organic charter reference educational background, communication skills, administrative or legislative experience. Nor does it mention personal traits, such as judgment, compassion, or that all-purpose resume buster works well with others. These and a host of other factors, including ideological and policy preferences, are left to you, the electorate, to weigh. Can history help? Forgive my bias, but I've always believed the more you know of our past, the more optimistic you will be about our future. Today, millions of Americans of both parties and of no party feel alienated from a system which seems frozen in partisan gridlock. Yet history refutes the cynical notion that events are beyond our control. Think back to the all-too-human delegates who assembled in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787, knowing the odds were against them in any attempt to create a self-governing republic, the first since the fall of Rome. Remember, this was a generation defined by its resistance to centralized authority in the shape of kings. The Constitution makers reflected this concern, nowhere more than in their prolonged and heated arguments over the as-yet-to-be-defined executive. Should he be a they, not one individual but several, thereby diluting power by dispersing it more widely? Should he be elected by Congress or chosen by the states? Eligible for re-election or term limited? Benjamin Franklin thought the chief executive officer should serve without pay. George Mason of Virginia worried that the war powers granted the president were much too broad. Needless to say, the first suggestion has not been heard of since 1787, while the second concern is all too relevant to modern Americans. Before they were done, the founders had established the first set of criteria by which to judge presidential success or failure. They did not make it easy. Even George Washington, an equestrian of legendary skill, was unaccustomed to riding two horses at the same time. One marked head of state, the other head of government. The former would be above politics, while the latter must be something of a political animal. One would defer to the people's representatives in Congress. The other would defy them as he defined the national interest. Such tensions built into the office make it all but impossible to develop a unified field theory of presidential performance. Certainly, contemporary popularity is no guarantee of historical approval. Consider the fluctuating fortunes of Andrew Jackson, traditionally viewed as a frontier hero who made war on the Bank of the United States with the same ferocity he had once reserved for the British front line at New Orleans. The only president of his own age named after him, Jackson's influence in the 19th century was as pervasive as that of Franklin Roosevelt or Ronald Reagan in more recent times. His fiery response to would-be secessionists in his native South Carolina laid the groundwork for Lincoln's breathtaking assertion of presidential powers a generation later. And yet, 2 centuries on, it is not the swashbuckling old hickory that we remember, not the scourge of moneyed interests, not the original populist who proposed in his inaugural address 200 years ago to abolish the Electoral College in favor of direct popular vote. Rather, it is Jackson, the Indian killer, who dominates our collective memory. Jackson, the slaveholder and economic illiterate. Along with his Tennessee protege, James K. Polk, Old Hickory is identified with manifest destiny, the phrase once a glorious rallying cry for American exceptionalism, more recently a classroom synonym for imperial conquest. Traditionally, you'd find Polk just outside the Holy Trinity of Washington, Lincoln, and Roosevelt, and in between the near greats, TR, Truman, more recently Eisenhower. Jackson used to be there. The reason was because, as some of us were taught in school, James K. Polk, Young Hickory, as his admirers dubbed him, added more territory to the United States than any other president, 1.2 million square miles of it. Today, however, he is just as likely to be condemned for a Mexican land grab, foreshadowing a divisive decade, the 1850s, in which his countrymen argued over the spread of slavery into all those new territories carved out of Polk's ill-gotten gains. I must add, parenthetically, that Polk has fared better than Jackson, who may yet be bounced from the $20 bill, a fate originally planned for Alexander Hamilton until the runaway success of a Broadway musical setting his story to hip-hop rhythm made him as fashionable as Jackson is out of favor. It doesn't end there. There was a second musical off Broadway, moved to Broadway, called Bloody, Bloody Andrew Jackson. What all this points to is what I call the Mount Rushmore rule of presidential assessment. That is, while some presidents are literally carved in stone, most are subject to endless revisionism. And that's not a bad thing. It's said that journalists write the first draft of history, and they have advantages in doing so. Obviously, immediacy, proximity. But what that means in practical terms, to the historian at least, is a distortion. The distortion of a punishing and often superficial 24/7 news cycle. This applies with special force to presidents who generate more than the usual amount of controversy. Richard Nixon famously said it would be 50 years before anyone could write about him with objectivity. I don't know about that, but I will agree It takes time, as you heard in the introduction, it takes time for perspective to form. It takes time for passions to cool, for papers to become available, for people in the administration to come forward and perhaps speak with greater candor than they might have on Inauguration Day. It takes time for us to outgrow Clinton fatigue, Bush fatigue, Obama fatigue, to move beyond the conflict and clickbait of the modern media culture and compare them against their successors, who were fated to deal with many of the same issues that transcend any one administration. Case in point, a dozen American presidents, and counting, have grappled with the tangle that is the Middle East, some clearly more successfully than others. Likewise, the Cold War tested the mettle of chief executives from Harry Truman to the first George Bush. As Jackson's fate makes clear, it is the history yet to be written that causes presidential reputations to bounce around like corn in a popper. The older I get, the more suspicious I become of that academic parlor game called ranking the presidents, if only because it presumes, in the words of one scholar, to measure the immeasurable. For as the presidency evolves, so do our criteria for gauging success and failure. Talk about apples and oranges. The 19th century presidency has as much in common with the 20th century presidency as Franklin Pierce does with Franklin Roosevelt. Another case in point. Today, we assume, failure or not, that a president and his administration will take significant responsibility for the management of our economy. We certainly blame presidents in hard times, and somewhat more grudgingly, we credit them with prosperity. That's a relatively new development. The first Great Depression in American history took place under James Monroe, 1819. Well, guess what? In 1820, James Monroe was reelected with all but one elector. Clearly, no one blamed hard times on President Monroe. People don't talk about the Van Buren Depression, even the Grover Cleveland Depression. They talk about Hoover and the Depression, because by 1929, 30, 31, people had a different view of the presidency. Remember, in between, you'd had Teddy Roosevelt, who had more or less single-handedly reinvented the office and asserted powers that none of his predecessors would have imagined. Some of them economic, more certainly foreign policy, conservation, you name it. So by the time Hoover became president, people expected more of a president, and people assumed that a president had, I would argue, more power than he really did. Do you know, it's sort of the next time someone talks about the Great Depression, the New Deal, Hoover, et cetera, one thing that gets overlooked, in the modern era, the federal, I don't know what the exact percentage is, but you can find it online. The federal government is responsible for a very substantial percentage of gross national product. I mean, 15, 20, just to take a stab, but a major percentage, enough, certainly, to be able to influence significantly economic development. In 1930, the federal budget was $3 billion instead of $2+ trillion. That was less than 1% of the GDP. So even if a president wanted to fundamentally influence the course of the economy, he really didn't have the monetary tools at his hand. Speaking of Theodore Roosevelt, he had his own delightfully personal system for ranking presidents. He thought they should be divided into two categories, the Lincoln type and the Buchanan type. Modern political scientists use different words to say the same thing when they speak of transforming leaders versus transitional ones, the latter implication being they're mere caretakers. If this sounds self-serving, it was also prophetic. In sharp contrast to the 19th century, when presidents were more likely to be seen as administrators rather than advocates, the 20th century would belong to TR and other activists who ushered America onto the world stage, entrusted a private economy to public planners, and belatedly committed Uncle Sam to the fight for democracy at home as well as abroad. What began with the first Roosevelt was reinforced by the second. First, the Great Depression, then World War II, and the Cold War centralized power in Washington in ways that, quite frankly, the founders never imagined. More to the point, it personalized power in the presidency. By the 1960s, television brought us closer than ever before to the man in the Oval Office, even as it magnified the reach and influence of TR's bully pulpit. No one better captured the heroic presidency at the height of its powers than Clinton Rossiter, the premier political scientist of his age. Here's how he put it in 1951. The president, he wrote, is not a Gulliver immobilized by 10,000 tiny cords, nor even a Prometheus chained to a rock of frustration. He is rather a kind of magnificent lion who can roam widely and do great deeds so long as he does not try to break loose from his broad reservation. Well, Rossiter was writing under the spell of both Roosevelts. He was inclined to accept TR's audacious theory of presidential stewardship, arguing that a president is free to do anything not explicitly prescribed by the Constitution. Yet the life jacket of one generation can become the straitjacket of the next. The Rooseveltian model, however well adapted to crisis management, is not the only path to a successful presidency. Only recently have we begun to recognize that a strong president can, like Jackson in the 19th century or Reagan in the 20th, promote a smaller government. So forget Lincoln types and Buchanan types. Some presidents think FDR, LBJ, and yes, Barack Obama, promise us freedom through government. And others, Thomas Jefferson comes to mind, as does Reagan, and yes, Calvin Coolidge, promise us freedom from government. Neither model is perfect, neither is permanent. What the history of the last century demonstrates is the dynamism of an office that evolves with the challenges it confronts. Wartime leadership demands qualities that may be ill-suited to the tasks of post-war reconstruction. The high and holy work of abolition, the audacious vow to end poverty or pursue foreign terrorists into their remote caves. These historical milestones imply a different mindset from what it takes to build an interstate highway system or balance a budget. One school of thought disregards limits on government. The other enshrines them as the surest safeguards for our most cherished liberties. The plain truth is that most presidencies, like most lives, combine elements of success and failure. How, in a sentence, am I supposed to label Woodrow Wilson, whose first term was arguably the most successful in terms of legislative productivity in American history up to that time, and in many ways served as a forerunner for FDR's first 100 days, during which Wilson gave us the Federal Reserve, the Federal Trade Commission, child labor laws, for starters. Louis Brandeis, the first Jew to sit on the Supreme Court, touched off to modernize embarrassing, if not appalling, controversy at the time. Of course, we don't see Wilson as a progressive today. We see Wilson as a Southern racist. We see Wilson as a wartime president who, in many ways, rhetorically showed us the mountaintop and then signally failed to take us there at the Versailles Conference and the League of Nations. How do you apply a label to that kind of record? Lyndon Johnson, certainly the most committed civil rights president since Lincoln, and a man, whatever you think of the outcome or the expense, a man who sincerely, and I think idealistically, grounded in his own boyhood experience, in part teaching Mexican kids in a little school in Cotulla, Texas, wanted education to be a right, a universal right, and who believed that it was the role of the federal government in a time of great prosperity to try its level best to eliminate poverty. And yet, that is the same president who gave us the Vietnam War, and even more important in terms of the lasting stain that I believe even now adheres to the presidency. He gave us, remember, the credibility gap. For 50 years, people have been much less inclined to believe what their president or their government tells them. And it certainly wasn't exclusively his fault, but it began, arguably, with Johnson. And then, of course, that brings us to Richard Nixon, whose domestic record is most impressive, and who, of course, hopes 30 or 40 years from now that the first line of his historical obituary is the man who opened the door to China, as opposed to the only president forced to resign. Then there's a category of what I call the politically challenged presidents. William Howard Taft and Herbert Hoover were extraordinarily successful at everything they ever did in their lives except the presidency, where they were significantly unsuccessful. Each man said, almost quoting the other, how much he hated politics. It wasn't in his DNA. Herbert Hoover fed more people than Hitler, Stalin, Mao, and Pol Pot combined were able to kill. 1 billion people in 55 countries around the world. And that's just the beginning of the story that most people know very little about. But I don't think even Hoover's greatest admirers would claim that he was a successful president. He hated politics. He was an engineer. Well, engineers are very rational, and politics is not. There are some real temperamental parallels, I would argue, between Herbert Hoover and Jimmy Carter. Both of them, by the way, regarded as much more successful ex-presidents than when they were in the White House. There's a third category. It involves presidencies that are racked by scandal, financial, sexual, or both. Warren Harding's claim to the bottom rung of the presidential ladder, it's very secure, by the way, rests not on the recently confirmed child born out of wedlock to one of his mistresses, but to the rampant thievery that disgraced his Interior Department, the Department of Justice, and Veterans Affairs. In the last few years, Ulysses Grant has escaped his customary place in the presidential basement, less because we've uncovered new facts about his tenure than we interpret existing facts through a different lens and with different priorities. See, something called the 1960s happened. And the 1960s upended a lot of things, including the way we look at history. And the fact of the matter is, I think on balance, it was a healthy development. In the 1960s, we discovered there were millions and millions of American women, Native Americans, gay Americans, disabled Americans, Asian Americans, the list goes on, who had in effect been left out of the national narrative. Well, as their stories began to be told, we began to reconsider through this new light some of familiar old history. And no one has benefited more than U.S. Grant. The fact of the matter is, he was the last president for 80 years who was willing to send federal troops into the South to combat the Ku Klux Klan and to ensure the rights of the freedmen. He was virtually the lone holdout in terms of insisting, and he knew better than anyone, the Civil War was fought for a moral purpose. That said, none of this, it seems to me, should blind us to the pervasive corruption or political naivete which scarred his reputation in the past and even now limits the room for him to grow in our esteem. Again, it's a seesaw. No president sets out to fail. Maybe Warren Harding. In between his election and his inauguration, he said something that I'm telling you, I know it was well meant. Like many things, Harding was not a bad man. Alice Roosevelt Longworth had an acid tongue, and she once summed him up by saying, Warren Harding was not a bad man, he was just a slob. That's one way to characterize him. But he said something revealing, maybe unintentionally revealing. He said, I don't expect to be the greatest president, but I hope to be the most loved. I'm not sure he was referring to the woman in the closet, but in any event, he was certainly loved. Every president, it goes without saying, will make mistakes. Successful presidents learn from their mistakes. That's one yardstick you might use in judging executive performance. Presidential relations with Congress, management of the economy and foreign affairs, his skills as a party leader and public communicator, all are perfectly valid standards of measurement. Yet they are, to me, at least insufficient by themselves to convey how much our nation's highest office reflects the personal strengths and shortcomings of its occupants. So, this evening, let me leave you with 5 highly personal, decidedly non-traditional rules by which to distinguish the Lincolns from the Buchanans. Rule number 1, character counts. Never more so, one might add, than when a president commits young Americans to battle. But how then do you define character? It goes without saying we want our presidents to be men and women of principle. What happens, however, when principles come into conflict? In his effort to avert war with France, John Adams split his party and cost himself a second term. He may have failed as a partisan, but he succeeded as a patriot, even if it cost him a second term in the unfinished White House, into which he and Abigail moved in the summer of 1800. Sacrificing one's deepest convictions for political necessity hardly seems proof of character, unless Thomas Jefferson, in theory, was the strictest of constructionists. Yet history reveres him for putting aside his belief in limited government when Louisiana came on the market, and for 3 cents an acre, doubling the size of the United States overnight. More precisely, Jefferson allowed his constitutional principles to take a back seat to his continental vision of the United States. In his own words, I stretched the Constitution so far that it cracked. Most Americans, particularly those living west of the Mississippi, think it's a good thing he did. Richard Nixon was a principled anti-communist, at least until he looked into the 21st century and saw that it was in America's interest to bring China out of its self-imposed isolation. Lyndon Johnson staked his presidency on principles of racial justice and economic opportunity. There's a wonderful story told by James Farmer, the civil rights leader, the head of CORE, based in New York City, who was in the Oval Office before the passage of the landmark 1964 Civil Rights Act. And to his credit, he challenged LBJ. He said, you know, Mr. President, your record in Congress on this issue was very bad. And yet here you are, twisting arms, cajoling congressmen of both parties in an effort to pass the most sweeping civil rights legislation in history. Do you mind my asking what changed? And he said, Johnson thought for a minute, furrowed his brow, and then he leaned back and said, well, Mr. Farmer, let me answer your question by quoting something with which you are undoubtedly familiar, spoken by an associate of yours. He paused and he said, free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, I'm free at last. Of course, arguably, LBJ lost his presidency on a principle he may or may not have believed, the idea that America should pursue military victory in Southeast Asia, whatever the cost. Sometimes it's what a president doesn't do that reveals character. When the Berlin Wall came down in 1989, you can be sure that everyone in George Bush's White House was impressing upon him the need to get on Air Force One, fly to Berlin, get the photo op of the century, rub Mikhail Gorbachev's nose a little bit in this humiliation. And Bush, typically, refused to even consider it. And part of that was personal modesty. Remember, he always said, with that charming kind of broken syntax that he had, he quoted his mother as saying, no one likes a braggadocio. Well, he didn't want to be a braggadocio. But there was more to it than that. It was a very shrewd, if self-effacing, decision of state. And simply it was this. The reunification of Germany did not have to happen as smoothly as it did. The end of the Cold War did not have to happen without violence and dislocation. And we certainly should not, at the time, have counted on Soviet support in the first Gulf War to eject Saddam Hussein from Kuwait. The fact of the matter is, by not humiliating Mikhail Gorbachev and the system that at that point was clearly on its last legs, by not taking credit for winning the Cold War, Bush compiled in the bank of diplomatic credit a significant balance, which he was able to draw upon later on. That's character. You could have a nice headline in the Post, you could have 4 or 5 points in the Gallup poll, or you can pursue the national interest. In the evening of his life, George Washington offered himself up as a punching bag to his critics, among them a newspaper editor who was hired by Thomas Jefferson with State Department funds. Scribbling partisans called him a dupe of King George, a betrayer of the Revolution, in allowing his reputation to be shredded by the very forces of liberty that he had set in motion. Our first president laid down a marker for all his successors. Simply put, one does not get to Mount Rushmore by traveling the path of least resistance. History rewards the risk takers. Rule number 2, presidents require a sense of history. At the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the initial overwhelming response of JFK's advisors was to go military, to send planes in to try to take out the Soviet missiles on the island. And JFK listened to all of this and said something very, very shrewd. He said, how many of you have read Barbara Tuchman's new book, The Guns of August? Just been published. Well, of course, no one had. He saw to it that they did. He knew enough history, he knew the lessons of history, that he did not want history to repeat itself with incalculably greater consequences in the nuclear age, to have the superpowers stumble into an annihilating war, as 50 years earlier had happened in Europe. That said, we want our presidents to be students of history. We don't want them to be its prisoners. The fact of the matter is, for decades, presidents of both parties pointed to the lessons of Munich, which, in my opinion, they misapplied in committing and recommitting American troops to Southeast Asia. Rule number 3, next to a sense of history, presidents require a sense of humility, which is often expressed through a sense of humor. To laugh at oneself is the ultimate antidote to Potomac fever and the corruption of ego to which it leads. Humor can be blunt, but it can also blunt the sharp edge of political animosity. Grover Cleveland had few friends on Capitol Hill, particularly in the talkative guild that calls itself the world's greatest deliberative body. One night, true story, Cleveland was rudely awakened by his wife, who whispered to her husband that there were thieves in the house. "No, my dear," replied the president, "thieves in the Senate, not in the House." 130 years later, that line still always gets him. That tells us something about today's, never mind. Humor can disarm as well as deflate. Ronald Reagan delivered more age jokes than anyone since Jack Benny. To those critical of his administrative style, Reagan observed that the right hand of his administration didn't know what its far right hand was up to. In one breath, he could denounce the Soviet Union as an evil empire, and in the next, all but laugh it out of existence. So he defined a communist as someone who has read Marx and Lenin, and an anti-communist as someone who understands Marx and Lenin. I will never forget, I heard the story from his own lips more than once. He used to tell Gorbachev stories. But the remarkable thing is he told them to Gorbachev, which tells you something about the relationship that they must have had. Anyway, it's one day in Red Square, and there's an interminable line shuffling along, barely moving outside a consumer goods store, typically. And near the back of the line, there's a gentleman who finally loses it. He's had it. He throws up his hands and said, "I can't take it anymore. It's all Gorbachev's fault. I'm going to go shoot Gorbachev." So he leaves the line and trots across Red Square, his last scene going over the horizon. 24 hours pass. The line has barely moved. And all of a sudden, over the horizon can be seen first a little speck and then a human form. And someone says, "Hey, that's the guy who was going to shoot Gorbachev." Anyway, when he got within earshot, everyone in the line said, "Well, did you shoot Gorbachev?" And he said, "No, that line was twice as long." Rule number 4, successful presidents are mindful of TR's maxim. Keep your feet on the ground and your eyes on the stars. Part of the grounding process reflects a confidence and a humility born of adversity and challenges overcome. No one embodied this quality more than Franklin Roosevelt, the polio victim who refused to be victimized. He was hardly alone in this. His cousin Theodore lost both his wife and his mother on the same terrible day in February 1884, Lincoln struggled with poverty, death, and rejection at the polls. On the night before he became president, Gerald Ford held his wife's hand. Together, they repeated words that Ford had learned in a Grand Rapids Sunday school half a century earlier. Trust in the Lord with all thy heart, they prayed. Lean not to thine own understanding. In all thy ways acknowledge him, and he shall direct thy paths. Often, in times of trial, Ford had turned to those lines from the book of Proverbs. They had consoled him for the adolescent discovery that his stepfather was not his birth father. During World War II, they had steadied a young gunnery officer inches from death aboard a lurching aircraft carrier in the Philippine Sea. It was a different kind of storm that confronted the nation's only appointed vice president as he faced the prospect of becoming its only unelected president. Equally grounded was the Ford family, as demonstrated in exchange that occurred in their modest Alexandria home on the night of August 9th, 1974. Mrs. Ford, who had a delightful sense of humor, more about that later, was standing in their little postage stamp kitchen of their little ranch house in Alexandria. And she looks up and said, "Jerry, there's something wrong here. You're president of the United States and I'm still cooking." One month later, faced with the most critical decision of his presidency, Ford did not take a poll, he said a prayer. The streets around the White House were deserted when early on Sunday morning, September 8th, he slipped across Lafayette Square to take communion at St. John's Church. Returning to the Oval Office, Ford affixed his signature to the document immunizing his predecessor from prosecution for any Watergate-related offense. The Nixon Pardon, as no doubt many of you remember, unleashed a storm of anger, reminiscent of the calls for impeachment, touched off by Harry Truman's decision to fire General Douglas MacArthur a quarter of a century earlier. "I fired MacArthur because he wouldn't respect the authority of the president," explained Truman. "I didn't fire him because he was a dumb son of a bitch," he claimed, hastening to add, although he was. That morning, Tip O'Neill told Ford the pardon would cost him the 1976 election. Shortly afterward, a White House staffer rubbed his eyes in disbelief as O'Neill, so jovial and confiding when visiting his old friend in the Oval Office, turned harshly critical in front of reporters and TV cameras on the North Lawn. "He's saying terrible things about you," the young man reported to the president, who never looked up from his desk or removed the pipe on which he was contentedly puffing. "Don," said Ford, "that's politics." Which brings me to my fifth and final test of presidential leadership. The presidency is first and always a political job. Every face on Mount Rushmore is the face of a master politician. Granted, we don't think of our first president as a politician. In fact, no small part of George Washington's political genius, honed in the Revolution and perfected during 8 tumultuous years in the presidential office, was his ability to convince virtually everyone, beginning with himself, that he was no politician. Politics is theater, and Washington was our first actor president. There's a wonderful scene at Yorktown where the Continental Army has, in effect, stumbled into victory over Lord Cornwallis and the Lobsterbacks, thanks largely to the help of the French fleet. And on Surrender Day, the two armies are lined up, and not surprisingly, the American soldiers are in the mood to celebrate. And they're not above reminding their defeated foe of who won. And then suddenly, it's a classic Hollywood ending, except that it's true. Out of nowhere, Washington appeared on this great, massive white Charger called Prescott, which was a wonderful prop for inspiring hero worship. And he rode up and down the American line shouting, "Posterity will huzzah for us." He could afford to be modest, and he could afford to take the long view. Two qualities that I think we can all wish were more prevalent in modern, and I say that in a totally bipartisan way. Finally, there is the president against whom all others are measured. In no small measure, this is because he was, I would submit, the greatest politician ever to occupy the office. Abraham Lincoln was not a simple man. Law may have been his livelihood, but politics was his life. To his friend Joshua Speed, the rising politician, said in 1841 that he would be perfectly willing to die then and there. But he said, "I have an inexpressible desire to live, at least till I can be assured that the world is a little better for my having lived in it." Another friend heard Lincoln confide White House aspirations almost as soon as the two men met. "He never rested in the race he had determined to run," wrote this Lincoln intimate. "He was ever ready to be honored. He struggled incessantly for place." Yet even then, Lincoln's ambition was being purified through a growing involvement with the anti-slavery movement. Logic told him that it was hypocritical for a nation that professed to love liberty to keep millions of human beings in chains. Another kind of logic, the compelling logic of the battlefield, would bring him around to the view that a war originally fought over states' rights must ultimately be fought for human rights. Nothing less would justify, in history's eye, the 600,000 lives eradicated to remove the stain of human slavery. If you want one word to define Lincoln's presidency, it is growth. It is a cardinal article of our civic religion that when presidents put their hand on the Bible and recite that 35-word oath, first spoken by George Washington, that it's as if fairy dust is sprinkled over them, and they begin the process magically of growing in office. And some of them do, and some of them don't. Lincoln did. He grew in his management of men, in his political shrewdness. He grew in his grasp of military strategy. He grew in his powers of communication. Above all, he grew in the moral imagination that enabled him, at the end of his life, to leave behind the racist culture that had produced him. The last speech of his life, on April 11th, 1865, a crowd gathered on the White House lawn expecting to cheer, and to their surprise, they heard a very sober address from a president who was already immersed in the infinitely challenging issues of Reconstruction, of trying to bring this sundered union back together. And in the course of his remarks, he did something radical for the time. He endorsed the principle of black suffrage. And among those in the crowd that night was an actor named John Wilkes Booth, who, on hearing the president say this, turned to an associate and said, that's the last speech he'll ever give. And it turned out to be exactly that. As voters, we might well borrow Lincoln's words when questioning any candidate's capacity for leadership. At a particularly grim moment in the war, Lincoln told us, "The occasion is piled high with difficulty, and we must rise with the occasion." Sooner or later, every president will be asked to rise with the occasion. A century after Lincoln, a young, inexperienced leader was challenged by Cold War adversaries abroad, while at home he confronted unkept promises of equality as old as the Republic. John F. Kennedy listened to the inaugural address. Yes, it's eloquent, but it's the address of a classic Cold Warrior who, by the way, never mentioned civil rights once in his inaugural, who, if he'd had his druthers for political reasons, would have avoided that very controversial issue, particularly in the solid Democratic South of the 1960s. In June of 1963, 2 days, the two most important days of the Kennedy presidency, on June 10th, remember this is 9 months after the Cuban Missile Crisis, when we were all on the narrow window ledge of nuclear annihilation, and both sides pulled back, and both leaders realized that we couldn't go on like this. And that day, Kennedy gave a speech at American University in which, in effect, he opened the door to a nuclear test ban treaty, to a relaxation of Cold War tensions. The next day, June 11th, George Wallace stood in the schoolhouse door of the University of Alabama in a highly theatrical, pre-planned, and profoundly cynical show of resistance to the first African-American student to enroll there. Kennedy saw it on television, and he asked the networks for time that night to respond. The speech was not finished when the cameras began broadcasting. He literally improvised the last part of his speech, in which he threw away caution, threw away probably a lot of Southern votes, and committed himself and his administration to the cause of civil rights, promised a civil rights bill, which eventually morphed into the bill of 1964, passed after his death. That's growth. He came to realize that there is a moral imperative that comes with the oath of office. You don't simply occupy the office. You don't simply administer the government. Franklin Roosevelt famously said the presidency is preeminently not an administrative position, but a position of moral leadership. So give JFK the last word, so long as it's not a misplaced offense of poor old James Buchanan. Here are the tests he would have us apply to presidents now and in the uncertain future. When at some future date the high court of history sits in judgment on each of us, said Kennedy, our success or failure in whatever office we may hold will be measured by the answers to 4 questions. Were we truly men of courage? Were we truly men of judgment? Were we truly men of integrity? Were we truly men of dedication? 4 decades on, I would submit, we can modify this formula to read men and women. For America's first female president is an inevitable part of our unwritten history. That, too, is evidence of an unfolding plan that constitutes the true miracle at Philadelphia. The fact that an assembly of 55 white men, hardly representative even of their stratified society, could write a charter and devise a system of government capable over time of evolving into something far more inclusive, more truly representative of a land and a people that at their best have never become, but are always in the act of becoming. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard, for an enormously enlightening talk. We'll get to as many of your questions as we can. There are a lot of them. I'll begin with this one. How should one measure character in the time of social media? The average teenager can create an entirely new reality if given half an hour and a Twitter account. So how do you measure character when deception has become so simple?
Well, as I said, I think there's some permanent and fairly obvious rules. Integrity is timeless. Self-sacrifice is timeless. And also, I'm not a fan of the internet. I once very injudiciously answered a question when someone said, "What's the one thing you would do to improve our political system?" I said, "Unplug the internet." I still wish it were possible. But curiously enough, in this age of the internet, well, I was talking earlier, there are, untold numbers of young people, including, I suspect, people who are very tech savvy, who are learning history through a musical called Hamilton. They memorize the songs, they memorize the lyrics, and it's a lesson, not just a factual, but arguably in some ways a moral and certainly political lesson. So there are, I wouldn't give up the ship. There are, and even modern technology, the modern culture, however you define it, may have surprising ways to convey some qualities of character that are, as I say, timeless. And the other thing is just make sure they never, ever, ever grow up to be James Buchanan.
With inaction out of a divided Congress, have we lost one of our checks and balances and permitted too much presidential power, such as with multiple executive orders, et cetera?
Well, that's an evergreen debate. You can carry it further. There are people who are all upset about the courts, in effect. God, as long as the, impeach Earl Warren business in the 60s, there was a sense that the courts have, in effect, stepped into and appropriated for themselves functions that the founders didn't intend. By and large, however, that is because our elected officials are unwilling to address those issues themselves, whether they're too politically hot to handle, whether their donors don't want it. I don't have a lot of sympathy for the legislative branch. It seems to me that at different times in our history, you could think of the years before the Civil War, after the Civil War, when in fact the legislative branch dominated the executive. So is anyone who thinks that this is a permanent condition, I would reassure if that is a concern. But first and foremost, Congress has got to learn to legislate. They've got to learn to work across the aisle, and they've got to learn that they're there working for us and not for their donors or their favorite cable news networks.
There is a question about the Supreme Court, a slightly different one, which is, given the dramatic evolution in the United States over 230 plus years, is the original intent approach of some Supreme Court justices still justified?
Well, I'm not a lawyer, and I certainly don't claim to be a judicial scholar. You will get a very heated debate, but I think the very fact that you will get a heated debate is an answer to that question. I don't think there's much danger of the originalist school riding roughshod over a majority of the court. Not every conservative, for example, on the court is an originalist. And you know, let 10,000 flowers bloom. Justice Scalia, who of course was most publicly linked with the notion of originalism, which I have never quite understood. But nevertheless, I respect the school that argues that, well, it's strict constructionism. It's what it was Jefferson before the Louisiana Purchase. We basically, the great deciding argument in history came in 1791 in Washington's first term. The question was, shall we establish a national bank? And Jefferson said to Washington, of course not. There's nothing in the Constitution that says anything about establishing a national bank. And Alexander Hamilton said, of course we need a national bank. I mean, any government that's empowered to build lighthouses, to guide commercial shipping, needs a bank, if only to service its salary and other immediate financial needs. Washington sided with Hamilton, and that was a decisive day in American history. But the argument goes on, and it's a healthy thing that, I grew up thinking I was all of 14, 51 years ago tonight. I was on the floor of the Republican National Convention in Miami, carrying my Rockefeller for President sign. My contribution to that year's political violence. I remember our demonstration, I knew we were going to lose. I'd been doing my little calculations all day, and Reagan wasn't keeping his end of the bargain. And so, Nixon was going to win narrowly. People forget, Nixon only won that nomination by 25 votes on the first ballot. A couple more states had gone the other way, and Nixon would have unraveled, and then you would have had a convention deciding between Rockefeller and Reagan. That would have been interesting. In any event, I was carrying my Rockefeller sign in our demonstration, and we marched through a group of stolid Iowa farmers for Nixon, one of whom I remember striking over the head with my sign. And it didn't get us any votes, but it felt awfully good, at the time. So I understood how the French students rioting at the Sorbonne must have felt.
Given your historical comments, do you view current discussion of abolishing the Electoral College as possible?
I hope so. I mean, and by the way, that has nothing to do with current politics. I disagree with Andrew Jackson about a lot of things, but I actually find myself agreeing with him about his call and the reasoning. It was very simple. Andrew Jackson, for all his failings, and they are many, there's a reason why Andrew Jackson was lionized in the 19th century. There's a reason why he was regarded as one of the most influential, consequential of presidents. Because Andrew Jackson, more than anyone else, was the man who began the process of converting the republic into a democracy. And God knows, an imperfect democracy, certainly by modern standards, even by standards of the time. But compared with the well-bred, well-read men who presumed to govern during the early Republican small r phase of our history, Jackson represented a profound change. And needless to say, that change was controversial then. And in some ways, he's controversial today for the wrong reasons. But in any event, he believed that the Electoral College was simply undemocratic. It was as simple as that. He believed that the president was the only officer elected by everyone, and therefore the president had a unique stewardship role. The president was entrusted with caring for the health, if you will, of the young republic, and living up to what we proclaim to be self-evident truths in the Declaration. And his reading of the Declaration led him to believe that there was no reason why financially well-off merchants in New England should decide the presidency at the expense of yeoman farmers in Tennessee or what would become the Midwest. In any event, it's an interesting argument. I don't think it's going to happen. I doubt if it happens in my lifetime. But you know what? It will happen one day, because that is the trend, the long-term trend of American history. Why do you think we build monuments to Washington, Jefferson, Lincoln, and FDR on the Mall? Each one of those presidents, in his own way, imperfect as it seems to modern eyes, each one of those presidents, in his own way, contributed to the spread, even the fulfillment of democracy. Something of the idea that people could govern themselves without a monarch, or quite frankly, a church or an aristocracy to tell them what was in their interest. And that, if you stop to think over the last 200 plus years, it's not linear, it's not uninterrupted. There are not periods when people despair, but stop and think, as I said at the end of my remarks, the real miracle in Philadelphia was entrusted to Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Frederick Douglass and Martin Luther King, and I could go on and on. Those are the people we build monuments to. And there's a reason, because those are the people we want to be associated with in history.
On that happy note, I think I'll move to our last question, and I wonder if you would talk a little bit about your next major book project.
Well, I am 2/3 of the way, 616 pages, to be precise, of a comprehensive and, I believe, surprising life of Gerald Ford. It's a unique, every book is project. I spent 14 years writing the life of Nelson Rockefeller, and it probably subtracted an equal number of years from my life. The Ford will be about half as long in time. But I can tell you, it's a much more interesting story, frankly. It's a much more colorful and emotionally poignant story. And I will give you, I don't know if I'll leave you with this, but I know I'll regret this, because this is, I'm told this is not off the record. In any event, Mrs. Ford, I was highly privileged to get to know them in their later years. And each of them asked me to deliver the eulogy at their funeral. And thank God I uncharacteristically exercised restraint and did not include this in my tribute to Mrs. Ford, with Bill Clinton sitting to my right next to Barbara Bush. Mrs. Ford had a delightful, somewhat ribald sense of humor. It was a classic case of opposites attracting. With President Ford, you had to explain the jokes, you know? He was a Boy Scout. He was an Eagle Scout. And the jokes sort of went over his head, which was fine, you know? But anyway, the girls would get together and they would tell jokes. And anyway, at the very beginning, the very onset of the whole craziness over Monica Lewinsky, it was that, if you remember, and you certainly can be forgiven for wanting to forget, at the very beginning of that year-long departure from rationality, there was some real question about whether President Clinton would survive the weekend. Typically, panic set in, the media went overboard, you know, the usual. Anyway, that Friday, the story had just broken. Mrs. Ford came back from the hairdressers, which is obviously where she heard and she said, well, did you hear Al Gore is one orgasm away from the presidency? That's President Clinton, I think. By the way, it's only fair to add that both President and Mrs. Clinton became very good friends, very close to the Fords. They spent time with them in Vail, played golf together, and Mrs. Clinton, it was interesting. President Ford, frankly, President Ford was appalled by President Clinton's personal behavior at that point. But he did something very courageous. I know, because I helped him write it. A month before the 1998 off-year elections, without telling anyone, he wrote an op-ed piece for the New York Times in which he basically suggested, let's pull the plug, let's short-circuit this impeachment process, the outcome of which we all know, and which he frankly thought was bad for the country, bad for the presidency, but also, candidly, bad for the Republican Party. And his idea, and he had particular authority because he was the only man in America who had been through anything remotely like this. His idea was what he called a unique punishment for unique offense. He would have the President of the United States appear before a joint session of Congress, stand in the well of the House, and be formally rebuked. It wasn't a censure which could be undone. It would be televised, and he, of all people, knew the power of television to create lasting images, and indeed, the first draft of history. And his thought was that we would have, in all the squalor and the political jockeying, that out of that we would have somehow found a dignified, innovative way to acknowledge the president's offense and then basically let the country get back to business, which is what most people, at least told the pollsters, they wanted. And I'll tell you a story, which I've not told before, and it won't really come as a surprise, but in the course of my research, when this first appeared, I know, because I saw some of the mail, President Ford was subjected to some of the most vicious mail that you can imagine. But the Clinton White House was definitely interested in this as a way out. Well, then came the elections, and if you remember, you know, everyone expected Republicans to gain seats, and instead, very unusually in a midterm, particularly the 6th year of a presidency, which is the graveyard for presidents. But clearly, in reaction to this whole business, the Democrats actually picked up seats. And that's when, I believe, Speaker Gingrich left, and anyway. Then, of course, the shoe was on the other foot. All of a sudden, there were people in the impeachment camp who thought it was a terrible idea before the election, who discovered all kinds of hidden virtues after the election. And by the same token, the Clinton White House suddenly decided, no, we don't want to subject ourselves to such a demeaning procedure. And so it never happened. And everyone went on about their business. I suppose it was fated to happen. It was not a shining day for anyone, as far as I was concerned, in American democracy. But we survived it, and but I still think if Ford's suggestion or something like it had been taken up by both sides, I think the country would have approved, and I think our history would look a little better. My bias.
Richard, thank you very much.
Thank you.